The rain outside battered against the glass wall, its rhythm unyielding, almost like it was echoing the growing tension inside of me. My gaze drifted to the wet city skyline, unfocused, while my phone buzzed softly on the counter. His message was short. "I'll be there soon." My younger brother, 22, fresh out of college, yet already a mystery, wrapped up in his own ambitions and restlessness. It had been months since we last saw each other. Busy lives, different priorities, the usual excuses. We exchanged messages whenever the silence between us stretched on too long. But recently, I'd found myself missing him in a way that felt unresolved, like there was something left unsaid. And now, here he was making the trip just to visit, as if he'd sensed it too. As I set my phone down, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass, rain-speckled and distant. I looked older. A stranger, even to myself. At 26, I had become used to the solitude in this city, this place that both felt endless and stifling. Yet, a strange warmth tugged at me, reminding me of all the shared memories and familiar arguments from childhood. Those moments now seemed like another lifetime. Then the doorbell rang, snapping me out of my thoughts. I took a steadying breath, walked across the cold wooden floor, and opened the door. I expected the same shy, slightly messy version of my brother that I remembered. But standing before me was someone different, more confident, almost startlingly so, with an easy smile that seemed a little out of place. His sharp, curious eyes held a hint of something unfamiliar, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Hey," he greeted, pulling me into a hug that was too brief, like he was holding something back.
"Missed you."
His voice was familiar but deeper, carrying a weight that made me study his face. But there was nothing to see, just his usual warm expression. Maybe I was overthinking it. It had been months, after all, and people change. But still, something felt different. We moved into the kitchen, and I busied myself with making tea, sneaking glances at him over my shoulder. He looked around the room, his hands resting on the counter, as though he were seeing everything for the first time. It was odd. I'd never seen him look at my place with such intensity before. When our eyes met, he flashed a smile, and I quickly turned away, feeling foolish. "So, what have you been up to?" I asked, trying to shake off the odd feeling that had settled between us. "More or less the usual," he said, offering no further details. There was an unusual calmness in his tone, a measured distance, like he was carefully picking his words. His eyes roamed again, across the walls, the shelves, the scattered books on the coffee table. Finally, his gaze landed on me, and I felt myself tense under the weight of his scrutiny. "The place looks nice."
"Different than I imagined."
"Thanks," I replied, though the compliment felt hollow. He'd visited before, but never noticed these details. For some reason, his words felt strange, as though he were studying me, dissecting every little thing with an intensity that bordered on uncomfortable. I turned away, pretending to focus on arranging the teacups, hoping to avoid the awkward silence. "So," I said, pouring hot water over the tea leaves and letting the steam rise between us. "What made you decide to come all the way here? It's not exactly around the corner." He shrugged, glancing away. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he met my eyes again, his expression a mix of warmth and something else I couldn't name. "I wanted to see you." 3 simple words. But they hit me harder than I expected. I swallowed, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't place. It was just my brother after all. We'd been close since we were kids. So, why did his presence feel so different? So charged? Like there was something unsaid between us. We carried our cups to the living room, and as we settled on the couch, I noticed a prickling unease. He'd relaxed into the cushions with ease, completely at home. But there was something in his demeanor, both familiar and distant, that made me study him more closely. He met my gaze, his face unreadable, and for a moment, we sat there in silence, listening to the rain patter against the window. Breaking the silence, he leaned forward, narrowing his eyes in a way that almost felt like a challenge. "You look different," he said, his voice soft, but with an undercurrent of curiosity, or maybe fascination.
Differently how?
I asked, forcing a casual tone, even though his words had caused a flicker of unease in me. He paused, almost as if weighing whether to say more, then shook his head with a small smile. Just different. It was a strange, vague statement, yet it lingered between us, filling the air with something unspoken. I felt my cheeks warm, unsure of why his words unsettled me. Before I could respond, he turned away, breaking the tension. "Do you remember that storm from a few summers ago?" he asked suddenly, his tone turning nostalgic. I nodded, relieved by the change in topic. "Yeah. You were terrified the power would go out. Remember how you kept a flashlight by your bed for weeks after?" He laughed, shaking his head. "You exaggerate. But I do remember how you made us sit together in the hallway just in case." As he spoke, the tension between us began to ease, and a sense of warmth crept in, replacing the earlier discomfort. We started sharing more stories, slipping into the easy rhythm of old times. Falling back into the comfortable banter of our past, memories flowed like pages from a shared history, and for a moment, I almost forgot about the strange undercurrent of tension that had been present since he walked in. But despite the easy flow of conversation, that feeling still hung in the air, just beneath the surface. The way he looked at me, the way his words were carefully chosen, it all felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something, and I couldn't shake the sense that whatever it was would change everything. For now, though, I pushed it aside, hoping it was just the weight of too much time apart. The next morning, a light drizzle had returned, casting a grayish glow over the streets as we left my building. With no particular plans, we wandered aimlessly, talking about everything and nothing. I couldn't help but notice how he'd become quieter, less the playful little brother I remembered and more like this introspective, almost enigmatic person walking beside me. There was something untouchable about him now, as though he carried secrets, parts of himself that he wasn't eager to share. Our footsteps echoed softly on the damp streets. Eventually, we found ourselves standing in front of the old city library, a place we used to visit on weekends when we were kids, getting lost in endless rows of books, in worlds we'd never known. On a whim, I suggested we go inside. It felt oddly right, like revisiting a hidden part of ourselves. He agreed, and as we stepped into the quiet, musty space, a wave of nostalgia washed over me. The library was softly lit, with shadows filling its corners, and I could still feel the chill from outside clinging to us. The scent of aged paper and wood enveloped me, offering a brief moment of calm. We wandered through the aisles, moving quietly, our hands brushing against the shelves as if trying to reach back into the past. Every now and then, I'd glance over at him, curious about what was going through his mind, about the thoughts hidden behind that intense, faraway look. Eventually, I paused in front of the poetry section. Running my fingers across the spines, I picked up an old book I recognized from years ago, a collection of poems we had once laughed at, too young to appreciate the deeper meanings within. He saw the book in my hands and raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile breaking through his usual guarded expression. "Still reading the stuff?" he asked softly, leaning against the shelf. I shrugged, feeling my face warm slightly. "Guess I never really outgrew it." He moved closer, flipping through the pages as if seeing them with fresh eyes.
You were so obsessed with this back then.
I remember how you'd read those lines out loud like they were spells or something. His voice carried a teasing tone, light and gentle, pulling me back to simpler times. I met his gaze, smiling. "You were the one who always rolled your eyes and pretended you didn't care." "I cared," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious, his eyes lingering on me. I looked down, a strange tightness forming in my chest. The silence that followed was thick, almost electric, like the stillness before a storm. His presence seemed closer than it had in a long time, and something inside me tightened. And then, in an instant that felt out of place, everything shifted. It was a moment that seemed suspended in time. Without any thought, we drew closer, and before I fully understood what was happening, our lips met in a brief kiss, something neither of us had anticipated. It was like a spark, small but strong enough to jolt me back into reality. The space between us grew almost immediately, the tension breaking as we both pulled away. My heart was racing, and every inch between us felt amplified. I couldn't bring myself to look at him for longer than a second. The room seemed to expand, and the silence grew heavier. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible, filled with what sounded like regret. His hand rose as though to touch my shoulder, but it froze midair before falling back to his side. He swallowed, his gaze shifting away, and I could see the inner conflict in his eyes. My mind was a whirlwind, confusion, disbelief, emotions I couldn't even name. The feeling of that moment clung to me, an invisible mark that wouldn't fade. I wanted to say something to make it feel less strange, less wrong, but the words wouldn't come. There I stood, staring down at the book in my hands as though it held answers I couldn't find within myself. After what felt like forever, he stepped back, slipping his hands into his pockets and looking down. "We should probably go," he said. I nodded, barely managing a response. It seemed like the only reasonable thing to do, though nothing about the moment felt reasonable. We left the library in silence, the sound of our footsteps echoing softly between the narrow aisles, each step a reminder of what had just happened. Outside, the rain was still falling, but now it felt colder, more invasive. I turned away from him, not ready to meet his eyes, not ready to confront the unspoken tension that hung between us. My mind raced to make sense of the moment, to put it into a framework that wouldn't disrupt everything. It was just a lapse, I told myself. A mistake, something that happened in a fleeting moment of vulnerability. It would never happen again. But the feeling lingered, stubborn and unshakable, like the dampness of the rain on my skin. He didn't say anything. As we walked back, our silence was broken only by the steady rhythm of the rain tapping against our umbrellas. When we reached my building, he paused at the entrance, and for a second I thought he might say something, anything to ease the tension. Instead, he gave a brief nod, his face a mix of uncertainty and unease. "I'll see you inside," he murmured before heading into the building. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone with the weight of that brief, unspoken moment between us. I lingered outside for a moment, my thoughts swirling, emotions tangled and raw. The rain continued to fall, cold and persistent. I took a deep breath, hoping it would calm me. But it didn't. The next day, the air between us was thick with tension, marked by awkward silences and sideways glances. I wanted to say something, to either explain or laugh it off, but the right words wouldn't come. He seemed to sense this, giving me space while maintaining a neutral, carefree front, as though nothing had changed. Later that afternoon, trying to shake off the awkwardness, he suggested we do something memorable. "Let's hike up Springwater Mountain," he said with a grin, as though it was the simplest idea ever. "Springwater Mountain," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's more than just a hike, you know." "Come on," he urged, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "You're always the one dragging me on adventures. Or are you too old for it now?" I laughed, pretending to be offended, but despite the unease from yesterday, I felt a spark of excitement at the idea, almost as though we were escaping the weight of reality for a few hours. "All right," I said, rolling my eyes. "But don't get mad if I slow you down." The drive to Springwater was quick, barely an hour, and we avoided talking about what had happened between us, sticking to safer topics, his plans after college, quirky characters from his new job, and random childhood memories. By the time we reached the mountain trailhead, I almost convinced myself that everything was back to normal. But as we began the steep, winding path, I realized this wasn't going to be the easy hike I'd imagined. The trail was narrow and rough, with jagged rocks at every turn. Within the first hour, I could already feel a familiar ache spreading through my calves. My brother, on the other hand, moved effortlessly, barely pausing to catch his breath as he navigated the rocky terrain. "Are you serious?" I muttered after yet another steep incline, stopping to catch my breath. "Do you ever get tired?" He turned back, a challenge in his smile. "We've barely started. Don't tell me you're already giving up." "Easy for you to say." I shot back, grimacing as I stretched my aching legs. "You haven't stopped once," I remarked. He shrugged, a playful taunt in his voice. Well, if you're giving up, I'll understand. Oh, please. I rolled my eyes, even though my legs were already screaming. I'm not giving up. With every step, my muscles grew heavier, and my breathing became more labored. He hardly slowed down, moving forward with the same steady determination he'd had from the start, glancing back every now and then just to make sure I was still following. I appreciated that he didn't push me to go faster, but there was a spark of annoyance at how effortlessly he was moving. I couldn't help but wonder if he ever got tired. 3 hours in, I was almost convinced he was superhuman. My legs felt like they were on the verge of giving out, each step a battle of willpower. But somehow, I kept going, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching me quit halfway up. When we finally reached a small clearing near the summit, the sky had shifted into shades of pink and orange. The view was breathtaking, stretching out before us like a never-ending tapestry of mountains and valleys. I collapsed onto a rock, barely managing to keep my legs from trembling.
See?
Worth it, wasn't it? He said, grinning as he took in the view. Ask me again when my legs start working, I muttered, too exhausted to manage a smile. I rubbed at my sore calves, feeling the ache intensify with every touch. I couldn't believe he was still standing, barely out of breath. For a moment, we sat in silence, the tension from yesterday replaced by a quiet calm that only comes after shared exhaustion. It felt like a temporary truce, an escape from whatever strange shift had taken place between us. But in that silence, I found myself wanting to ask him what all of this was for. Why? It was as if he'd been pushing me, testing my limits. As the sun dipped lower, we began our descent, which felt surprisingly easier on my legs. Even though the exhaustion had settled deep into my bones, the drive home was quiet, and I found myself drifting in and out of sleep, lulled by the hum of the engine and the fading colors of the sunset. The next morning, I woke to an ache so intense it felt like my legs had turned to stone. The simple act of moving my toes sent sharp jolts of pain through my calves, and I groaned, barely able to sit up. I tried to stand, but my knees buckled, and I collapsed back onto the bed, clutching my legs. There was a knock at the door, and before I could respond, he peeked in, grinning when he saw me sprawled out, wincing in discomfort. "Good morning, mountain warrior," he teased, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Oh, don't start," I groaned, pulling the blanket over my head to hide my embarrassment. "I'm not even sure I can walk." He laughed and crossed the room, sitting on the edge of my bed. "Guess you didn't pace yourself. 3 hours, no breaks."
Who does that?
"Who does that?" I shot back, peeking out from under the blanket. "You." He shrugged as if it was no big deal. "I thought you'd keep up." I rolled my eyes, but despite the soreness radiating from my legs, I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. For a moment, the strange tension between us seemed to vanish, and it was like we were kids again, laughing over silly challenges, daring each other to keep going. But then his smile faded, and he fell quiet, his gaze dropping as though he were searching for the right words. The easy, playful energy between us began to shift, and I felt that same weight from yesterday slowly return, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to break the silence, to ask him if he felt it too, this strange tension that lingered in everything we did. But before I could speak, he looked up, his expression serious, almost somber. "I know things have been different lately," he began, his voice low, "and I don't really know what to make of it." I was caught off guard by his honesty, but I felt the same uncertainty, the same confusion. "Me neither," I said softly, the words slipping out more vulnerably than I intended. We sat there in silence, the air thick with things left unsaid. By the evening, the awkwardness had started to lift, replaced by something more familiar. Maybe it was the exhaustion or just the sheer strangeness of climbing a mountain on a whim, but it felt like we'd carved out a fragile truce. My legs still ached with every step, reminding me of how far I'd pushed myself. But I didn't want to bring it up, especially not with him around. He'd teased me enough that night, his spontaneity still lingering in the air. "I think we should go to the art gallery downtown," I suggested, breaking the comfortable silence. It was hosting an interactive exhibit that promised a journey into the self, a concept I'd read about in a flyer. It sounded abstract, but something about it appealed to me. To my surprise, he agreed without hesitation. We entered the gallery, greeted by dim lighting and the soft murmur of visitors. The space had a serene, almost sacred atmosphere. The main room was enormous, with high ceilings and open spaces, its walls lined with strange installations that seemed to pulse with life, changing with the flicker of the lights. It felt disorienting, like stepping into someone else's dream, where reality was a little out of focus. He walked ahead of me, hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning each piece with a thoughtful expression. I lagged behind, watching him half the time and trying to make sense of the cryptic installations. The shapes seemed to move and shift, their shadows changing depending on the angle, giving each piece a new perspective. It was eerie, beautiful, and somehow fitting for the strange tension that seemed to hang between us. After wandering for a while, we entered a room filled with mirrors, large, old-fashioned ones with dark frames that swallowed the light. They reflected us from every angle, creating infinite versions of ourselves in every direction. I found myself standing in the middle of it all, feeling small, almost lost in the sea of reflections. I glanced to the side and saw his reflection beside mine, both of us suspended in that endless mirrored space. "It's strange, isn't it?" he said softly, his gaze meeting mine in the reflection. "Seeing yourself over and over like that." "Yeah," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Almost makes you feel like you're looking at someone else." Our eyes locked once more in the mirror, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to disappear. We stood there, locked in a never-ending loop of reflections, and I felt an unsettling chill, like some magnetic force pulling us together. My heart raced, and the silence between us thickened, charged with something I couldn't quite name. But before I could process it, someone else entered the room. Their footsteps echoed off the mirrors, shattering the moment. I turned quickly, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks as I broke eye contact, pretending to be engrossed in the nearest mirror. He seemed to sense my discomfort and cleared his throat, dropping his gaze as he took a small step back, creating a noticeable but subtle distance between us. We moved on to the next room, both of us quiet now, almost cautious around each other. This room was darker, with faintly glowing sculptures that cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. A few other visitors were scattered around, murmuring to each other, but in that moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the gallery. The only sound in the dim light was our footsteps as we stopped in front of an abstract piece made of glass and metal that seemed to swirl and twist. He leaned in a little, his voice low. "Are you okay?" His question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. The past few days had left me feeling unsteady, like I was constantly questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. But I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, I don't know. This place is kind of intense." He nodded, his expression softening.
"Yeah,
"It's different," he agreed. There was a hint of understanding in his voice, as if he felt the same strange undercurrent between us, though neither of us spoke it aloud. We stood there, both lost in our own thoughts, each of us caught in a quiet turmoil. After a while, we moved to another corner of the room where a twisted sculpture seemed to change shape under the shifting lights. We both stared at it for a moment, mesmerized. Then, almost without thinking, he reached over and brushed his hand against mine. It was so light a touch that I could have easily thought it was accidental. But he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers lingered against mine, and I felt a strange, familiar thrill shoot through me. Our eyes met, and this time, neither of us looked away. There was no one else around, no distractions, just the quiet tension building between us, stronger with every passing second. My pulse was racing, my thoughts a tangled mess, but all I could focus on was the steady warmth of his hand against mine. And then, without a word, he leaned in and kissed me. It was brief, just a quick brush of lips, but it was enough to send a shock through me, freezing me in place, unable to process what had just happened. We pulled apart, both breathing heavily, our eyes wide with a mix of surprise and something deeper. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us thick and charged. I could see the confusion, the longing in his eyes, and it terrified me. Finally, he stepped back, his hand falling away as he looked down. "I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what came over me. I shook my head, unable to find the right words. My mind was racing, a swirl of emotions that made no sense. I wanted to say something to ease the tension, to tell him that I felt it too, but the words wouldn't come. We stood there, the silence stretching on, both lost in our own confusion. The gallery around us felt colder now, more distant. The sculptures that had once seemed beautiful now looked alien, as though they were watching us, silently judging us. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there alone. My heart was racing, my thoughts a storm of emotions. I wanted to call after him, to ask him to wait, but something held me back. As I stood there, the quiet room surrounding me, I felt a deep wave of sadness. In that moment, I realized that whatever had sparked between us, it had changed everything, and there was no going back. The next morning, I woke to the weight of everything that had happened the night before. The silence in the apartment was thick, almost suffocating, and I could tell he was avoiding me. Whether it was out of regret, confusion, or something else, I couldn't quite tell. I found him in the kitchen, standing by the window with that same distant look in his eyes that I'd come to recognize but never fully understood. When he noticed me, he turned around, giving me a strange smile that didn't reach his eyes. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking, both caught in the same strange tension that had become our new normal. "So, are we just pretending last night didn't happen?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended. I could hear the tremor in my words, the uncertainty and hesitation woven into each syllable. He exhaled, a conflicted look crossing his face. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "Maybe it's better that way." The words stung more than I expected, but I forced a nod, trying to push down the lump in my throat. I saw the regret in his eyes, the way he avoided my gaze, and it made the emptiness inside me feel that much larger. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and took his hand. He didn't pull away. We stood there, our hands entwined, silent. The connection between us felt fragile, as if the slightest touch could shatter it. But for that moment it was enough. Finally, he whispered, "We need to let this go. Move on." I nodded. Even though every part of me wanted to argue, I knew he was right. We'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross, reached a place that couldn't be our reality anymore. But as he gently pulled his hand from mine and walked away, the ache inside me felt permanent. Months passed, and our lives fell into separate rhythms, as if we had agreed to erase that fragile connection we'd shared. I threw myself into work, into routines and plans that felt safe, predictable, and secure. I almost convinced myself that I'd moved on, that whatever had sparked between us was just a product of proximity, of shared histories, and faded childhood ties. But then one afternoon, while walking through the familiar city streets, I caught sight of him. He was standing by the cafe we'd visited that first night, hand in his pockets, staring out at the crowd with that same distant expression. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, watching him from a distance. He looked different now, maybe a little older, more reserved, as if he had folded himself into the background of his own life. I felt a pull to walk over, to say something, but I stayed rooted in place, conflicted about the part of me that still longed to bridge the impossible gap between us. Then, as if he sensed my presence, he turned. Our eyes met across the busy street. For a long moment, time seemed to freeze, and all I could feel was the silent connection passing between us. In his gaze, I saw it, a reflection of everything we had been, everything we couldn't be, and everything still left unspoken. Without a word, he gave me a faint, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes held something I couldn't name, something that felt like both a goodbye and a quiet acknowledgement of the bond we had buried. Then, He turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me standing there alone. And in that moment I knew, some connections leave scars too deep to heal. And some people, no matter how far apart you get, never truly leave you.